Hi, I'm Jess Romeo. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, clinical social worker, and a trans guy. I specialize in integrative psychiatry with queer and trans folks. And I'm so happy to have Rebecca here with us today. If you want to introduce yourself.
Fabulous. My name is Rebecca Miner. I use she or they pronouns. I identify as a queer femme and I'm a gender specialist, which means I work primarily with queer and trans youth and their journey of becoming, and am a guide to their parents and families in affirming it.
Awesome. I'm glad we're going to have this conversation about gender affirming healthcare and the gender affirmation process for kids and adolescents and their families.
Yeah, it's really important. I think more time sensitive than ever before.
Tell me a little bit more about some of the work that you do with kids and families.
Sure. So I have been in private practice for 7 years now. And what that has typically looked like is individual therapy sessions with queer and trans youth. Over the years, I started to see that parents and caregivers were really in need of more support. And so I added parent coaching as an option, in part so that that's something that I can do across state lines. So I'm able to work internationally now, which is amazing. So
Mm,
I actually work with families all over the world to be able to support around gender affirming care and just how to better show up for the kids and young people in their lives.
that's really great. I'm curious, as you've been doing this work, what are parents in need of right now?
So I would say the need has shifted. The overarching need is like, we love our kid. We don't know enough about this. Can you help us be better, basically?
Yeah,
And that's often like just doing some kind of basic psychoeducation around gender and sexuality and helping them kind of know what to expect. I always joke that this wasn't in the books they read when they were
right.
preparing to have a baby, right? So I often talk about kind of what to expect when you weren't expecting this. And so often it's about having a guide who has been down this road before, who's
Yeah,
able to help them kind of anticipate, okay, so we've crossed this threshold. Now, what do the next steps look like? What does coming out at school look like? What is telling our neighbors or our extended family, things like that. However, in the last year or so, I would say the requests feel more dire,
mm,
and are coming from families who are often living in states where they have either already lost access to care or are fearful that they will. And so some of that is helping them with contingency planning of figuring
mm,
out if they need to move, what that looks like, how they can access care in other places. I'm lucky enough to be based in Massachusetts, where we have a
yeah.
lot of gender affirming care options with all the major hospitals here. So sometimes it's about helping families relocate and get supports that I'm accustomed to, but also figuring out where they're located if there are options locally for them. Because not every family has the capacity or privilege to be able to
Resources,
up and move.
right.
Like this is, yeah. So
Mm,
it's both. Yeah. And sometimes I get to do intergenerational coaching, which is the coolest when I get to work with
mhm,
parents and grandparents.
yeah,
Because sometimes the adult children also need support communicating about this
right.
with their parents as
Yeah. Well, I know I'm glad you named that too. And just the problem today of people having to consider where they live and moving to a different state. But I
well.
know that there's some other conflicts I know that come up in this work. Like you mentioned, you didn't know to expect this.
Yes,
And for so many parents, I think this is brand new information. They're having to navigate a lot of misinformation. They're also having to navigate the informed consent process that contains some pretty nuanced information about what
absolutely.
to expect, but then also fearing being sort of labeled as non-affirming if they have some hesitation or ask more questions. So, I mean, how are
Yes.
you helping parents navigate that?
I appreciate that question. I think we don't actually talk enough about parents who aren't 1,000% on board, right?
Yeah,
And so often, like when you go to get a book about this, for example, if you look at what supports are available for parents, it's kind of usually in one of two camps where it's either like you fall down a rabbit hole of fake research and concerns about rapid onset gender dysphoria. And
right.
so it's like we're in the camp of, I don't believe that this is actually happening and it's a phase. Or it's like you need to be completely on board. You need to get a t shirt that says you're a trans mom and you're loud and proud and you're at
Right.
every parade. And there are a lot of parents who don't fall in those two categories and feel lost and confused in that in between.
Hmm.
And so I think a lot of my work is being a soft landing for parents of like, you can love your kid and not want this for them. Both of those things can be true,
Hmm.
but you still have to show up for your kid.
Yeah.
And so we can work through that. And I'd
Hmm.
much rather you work through that with me than with your kid.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the conversations initially are kind of letting them air their grievances and concerns, much of which is based in misinformation. And
Hmm.
so by simply being like, oh, well, of course you'd be worried that we're going to rush your kid right into surgery. Let me explain how the process actually works to you, because there
Hmm.
are a lot of checks and balances between where we are now with them wanting to just
Yeah.
change their name and get a haircut to
Hmm.
bottom surgery. And so, if we can kind of slow everything down, zoom out, provide a little more context, that anxiety level tends to come down, and it allows for parents to start to show up differently.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, that rings so true to me too. Just being a queer person from Alabama, came out in the mid 2000s. I did find that people needed this middle space. They
Yes.
needed someone to come down and reach for them to be
Mm-hmm.
able to actually take those steps forward. And I think it's tricky to do. Like, how far do we reach down before we're actually sacrificing or we're throwing some part of the community that's more marginalized under the bus? I think that's really tricky to do.
It is incredibly tricky, and it's a really hard thing to figure out in terms of a public facing message,
Yeah.
right? Because it could easily be misinterpreted
Hmm.
as like even when I say both of these things can be true, like
Yeah.
that could be incredibly painful for some people to hear.
Right.
Um, but it's what helps parents take that initial step
Hmm.
sometimes.
Yeah.
And within just a handful of sessions, we can look back and be like, look at how far you've come. Like, remember when
Hmm.
you were in tears and were like, I really don't want this. And I think, especially in the Northeast, there's a lot of kind of liberal expectation and parents who are like, I went to Wesleyan, like, I
Hmm.
studied women's
Yeah.
studies. I should be
Hmm.
fine with this, but it's different when it's your own kid, and that's
Hmm.
okay. Now, what are we going to do to make sure that the young person gets the care and support that they need while you unpack your own stuff with someone like me?
Absolutely. What do you find people tend to be unpacking?
I think the thing that I have found most successful in breaking down that initial barrier is inviting parents and caregivers into their own inquiry around how the binary has harmed them too. Right. So it's once
Yeah.
you get parents thinking about, like, oh, yeah, that was really unfair when I was a kid and I couldn't participate in this activity, or I was told that my feelings were too much, or that girls don't do this and boys don't do that.
Hmm.
And really starting to unpack their own relationship to the binary and the limitations imposed within it,
Yeah.
that they start to see, like, wait a minute, this is not actually serving any of us.
Hmm.
And I don't want to raise my kid in a house where we hold these expectations. And I think that has been the thing that moves the needle most dramatically. That has proven far more successful than any tactics of fear or shame. And we know that as like
Hmm.
providers, that shame doesn't produce the outcome that we're often looking for, but it does get used, unfortunately. And parents do talk about, like, well, we went to this doctor and they told us, our kid's going to die if we don't do this. And that just made us feel even more frozen and stuck. Um, and so I think there's a much more positive way
Yeah.
of going about that, that kind of invites them to recognize that themselves. Most people who aren't trans haven't explored their gender. They
Hmm.
never had to,
Yeah.
right? They were just like, oh, you go in that line, you go in that line. There's
Hmm.
only two options, keep it
Hmm.
moving.
Exactly.
Um, and so starting to unpack that is what I think has been most fruitful.
It's so aligned with other social movements, other responses to moral panics. And
Yes,
for a little bit of a clinician moment, this is very aligned with the type of motivational interviewing work we would do with any
exactly.
kind of behavior that we're wanting to move along, right?
Exactly.
Is
Right.
letting people see this isn't just about my kid. This isn't an issue that's separate from me. This actually affects me too. And
Yes.
having us reflect on, well, how do I feel about that?
Yeah. Because ultimately, it is a journey for the whole family, right?
Yeah.
Parents, without consciousness of that, often come to me solely focused on their kid and what this is going to mean for their kid. But it's also going to have an impact on all of their relationships and how
Right.
they move through the world, and whether they talk to their coworkers openly, or whether they feel welcome in the faith spaces that they've been a part of and felt connected to, right? There
Mhm.
are all these other ripple effects that need to be considered as well. So yeah, I think working with parents has been one of the most rewarding parts of
Yeah.
my work that I never expected, because I love working with young people and was
Mhm.
like, this is what I'm going to do forever. But I realized that I can only help so many young people, and I can only help them so much if they're still going home to an environment where their parents aren't necessarily on the same page or don't have the information that they need to show up
Mhm.
in the way that they really want to.
Yeah. I really liked your framing. So I think one nice takeaway from what you've just said is that there doesn't have to be one broad message that accurately captures all the nuance and helps to bring someone along, because there's no one message that's going to reach everyone. You have to tailor it toward the individual person. Like, what is their journey? What's coming up for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially when there's more than one parent, they're each coming to
Right.
that conversation with their own stuff. And
Hmm.
often it's one parent more than the other. And one thing I want to name on that front is that I think oftentimes people assume that it's the dad. And what I have seen over the years is that often the birthing parent has a harder
Hmm.
time adjusting to some of those changes initially. And my kind of like armchair
Uh-huh.
thinking around that is that there's so much more dreaming and thinking about
Hmm.
who this child will be in the future
Yeah.
that starts well before they're even birth side.
Yeah.
And so it takes that kind of mental gymnastics to
Hmm.
start to let go of who they thought their child would be, and acknowledge that that doesn't need to disappear, that that doesn't need to be a loss. Because
Yeah.
I think we also can get stuck in that grief narrative that centers the parents over the young person's need.
Say
Um,
more about what you mean by that.
Something I see a lot in clinical spaces and just in trans kind of in parenting spaces is talking about, I lost my kid, or I'll never have my daughter back. And it's often focused on the parents'
Hmm.
loss and what a terrible thing it is for them to have lost their child, when in fact their child is right there and always has been, and just maybe doesn't look exactly what they imagined. But it's not serving anyone ultimately to
Hmm.
focus and get stuck in that grief when your kid is right there and they're begging you to see them for who they are. And so again, I'm like, if you're feeling grief, that is yours to feel. And I'm
Hmm.
not saying that that's not okay.
Yeah.
And I beg of you to process that with someone who isn't your child, because I have heard from far too many young people that
Hmm.
that's something that their parent has said to them, like, you need to give me time because I'm still grieving, or like, I'll start using your name when I'm ready, but I'm still grieving.
Hmm.
And it's like, well,
Right.
that's actually not going to work long term.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's so important that two things are true at the same time. Parents deserve that space
Mhm,
and deserve to take it for themselves.
mhm. Yes.
And
Yeah. I
with the
mean, the
caregiver.
thing that comes to mind for me is I vividly remember a mom sitting on my couch crying, and she was like, it's like he's asking me to rewrite history.
Hmm.
And like, that we can hold, that we can work with.
Yeah.
And you still need to make the appointment, and you still need to do the things that move the process forward for your kid.
Yeah.
Um, but so often, when the grief doesn't get processed, that's when we see parents not following through with making the appointments, doing the learning and education that they need, and ultimately holding up a process that we know is life saving care.